King and his followers were met with fierce resistance from the police. Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, backed by the majority of white residents, was determined to stop the demonstrations. Without enough volunteers to continue the protests, King and other leaders enlisted hundreds of young school children to keep the marches going and fill up the jails. The young African-American student protesters would gather here on the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church and hear inspirational speeches from civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They would then file from the church and walk across the street to a park where they were determined to demonstrate peacefully for equal rights.
I was arrested after we got about a block away from the church in this area.
Janice Kelsey was 16 years old when she and her schoolmates were jailed.
My mind was made up. I was going to participate. I was going to go to jail. I wanted to get my freedom.
Then on the second day of the student demonstrations, things turned violent. Police turned high-pressure fire hoses on the young people and set attack dogs on them. Birmingham civil rights leader Reverend Calvin Woods was there.
There had been some dog fighting, some beating, some killing. Many people were beaten and spit on and put in jail, lost jobs. But those were minor things compared to what we felt we had to do.
The brutal crackdown was widely televised, and images of the event were seen around the world. Robert Corley says this incident galvanized new support for the civil rights movement.
It was really that children's crusade that really turned the tide, because it did serve the goal of filling up the jails and forcing the white community to come to the table with King and negotiate some sort of settlement.
Eventually, King and Birmingham city leaders reached an agreement. Within months, the local segregation laws were abolished. Reverend Woods says King's determination to keep the movement going made all the difference.
But we would not have accomplished what we did if it had not been for the support and leadership that Dr. King brought.
The Birmingham campaign was a climactic battle of the civil rights movement. For many, it stands as an iconic symbol of the sacrifices made by King and thousands of African Americans. Chris Simpkins, VOA News, Birmingham, Alabama.
Okay. This is the second video I want to show. I think we're still presenting. Okay, second video. This is on the march. Let's see if I get this going. Turn the volume down a bit. Okay.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
African Americans in Alabama have had enough. In spring 1963, in the state's largest city, Birmingham, they staged nonviolent demonstrations. Wallace responds. Protests are banned. Those arrested forced to pay high bail. Then, America's most prominent civil rights leader comes to Birmingham. April 12th, Good Friday. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy lead a march from the 16th Street Baptist Church. They are arrested. It is here that King pens his now celebrated letter from Birmingham jail, defending the resistance of African Americans.
solitary confinement, he writes, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
I just want to pause it here. When Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and he was placed in the jail, he went through a period of anxiety, of loneliness, of self-doubt, a little bit of depression as well. And being in a solitary confined jail simply for walking down the street is something that's very difficult for someone to understand. And then as he stayed in the jail, he kept thinking of St. Paul. And St. Paul was initially persecuting Christians and then became a Christian himself and was charged with treason, sentenced to crucifixion. And then before they were to crucify him and kill him, he, as a Roman citizen, he appealed his conviction. And so he had to go to Rome for his appeal. It took about 2 years. And throughout the 2 years, St. Paul was always in jail, writing letters, smuggling them out to different Christian groups. So when he was in Jerusalem, it was his letters to the Hebrews. When he was in Corinth, a letter to the Corinthians. And when he eventually was in Rome, a letter to the Romans. And they become the epistles of Paul. What inspired Martin Luther King Jr. was actually the letter that those other priests and rabbis wrote to him. And that sort of awakened his determination, and he started to write the letter. So that got him out of his depression, his anxiety in jail, and he became very, very excited. Now the letters had to be smuggled out. So he would meet with his lawyers, and he would write them on pieces of paper that he scraps. Lawyers would smuggle them out, and then they would type them all out for them, and then eventually got published by the Quakers. Okay, so this think of what's going through Martin Luther King Jr.'s mind right now in jail, and a lot of children, like 14-year-olds, were in jail. Now, so many people were arrested that they couldn't bail them out, because in order to bail them out, you had to pay some money as like an insurance policy, and they couldn't afford to pay the bail. Not a rich organization. So Martin Luther King Jr. and also a lot of the children had to stay in jail, not for one night, but for a long time sometimes.
The letter becomes a touchstone for the civil rights movement.
Okay, so that's it. Okay. Now, I'm gonna stop right there. No, actually, let's go right through it. This is it's a long one, sorry, but I think it's invaluable for us. And let me just check, see if my last student has showed up. Looks like, yep. So let me check the attendance. So we're still presenting. Okay, so let's go through this one here. You'll get lots of ideas with this one here. Got captions. Make sure, okay, we're good.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. And before freedom's sake, I'll be buried in my grave and go to my Lord and be free. No more weeping, no more weeping.
be free. Oh, freedom, freedom. Oh, freedom, freedom. Willingness to go to jail will make jobs possible for everybody else who will finish school. Negroes going to school, we finish school and can't get any jobs out anyway. They throw us in the worst position, and whether we have high school training or not, or beyond that, we are still the last child in the first five. So what we've got to see is that the things that are being done in such a creative manner by you will make Birmingham a better city for everybody.
My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statements in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. I think I should indicate why I am here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage and a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise.
So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I'm here because I have organizational ties here. But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom far beyond my hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly.
Okay, stop right there. I told you I would try and help. That's a really good example of justice. There's actually two of them here. Injustice anywhere is injustice. Injustice anywhere is injustice here, and vice versa. And whatever affects one person affects the other. You can also use that in terms of the idea of love. That if someone is hurt, then you are hurt too. This is what Jesus meant by love your neighbor as yourself.
Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds.
You deplored the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure that left the Negro community with no alternative. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. We have gone through all of these steps in Birmingham. There can be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known.
Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. These are the hard, brutal facts of the case. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers, but the latter consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiations. Then last September came the opportunity to talk with the leaders of Birmingham's economic community. In the course of the negotiations, certain promises were made by the merchants. For example, to remove the store's humiliating racial signs. On the basis of these promises, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to a moratorium on all demonstrations. As the weeks and months went by, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. A few signs briefly removed returned. The others remained.
As in so many past experiences, our hopes have been blasted. and the shadow of deep disappointment settled upon us. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and the national community. Mindful of the difficulties involved, we decided to undertake a process of self-purification. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? We decided.
Okay, we'll stop right there. Before any of the people would march and protest, they actually had to prepare for what was going to happen. And Martin Luther King Jr. was very serious about this, that you cannot in any way respond to violence with violence. You had to be peaceful. And if you were not prepared to be peaceful, not to get revenge or retaliation, then he didn't want you participating because you were not ready for the nonviolent protests. So this is what it means by self-purification. They had to actually get themselves ready to be able to protest without reacting, without responding, without using violence against violence. Somebody, just like double check, 1 second. I'm going to go through all the questions later. Okay, everyone. So let's go back here.
Decided to schedule our direct action program for the Easter season, realizing that except for Christmas, this is the main shopping period for the year. Knowing that a strong economic withdrawal program would be the byproduct of direct action, we felt that this would be the best time to bring pressure to bear on the merchants for the needed change.
Then it occurred to us that Birmingham's mayoralty election was coming up in March, and we speedily decided to postpone action until after Election Day. When we discovered that the Commissioner of Police Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, had piled up enough votes to be in the runoff, we decided again to postpone action until the day after the runoff, so that the demonstrations could not be used to cloud the issues. Like many others, we waited to see Mr. Connor defeated, and to this end we endured a postponement after postponement. Having aided in this community need, we felt that our direct action program could be delayed no longer. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and fosters such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. By citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension.
Okay, stop right there. A nonviolent, peaceful reaction is a sign of love. You love the person so much that you will not do anything that will hurt the person. You may disagree with their ideas. You may disagree with their actions. You may disagree with the system that they put in place to keep you down, to keep you segregated, to keep you feeling that you are second-class citizens, if citizens at all. You may disagree with all that, but you don't disagree with the person. So the idea of love includes forgiving the person for what they're doing, and accepting the person and trying to make things better for them, to make them realize that what they're doing is wrong. But you don't do it in a violent way, and that's a sign of love. It's also a sign of humility because you're humble enough that you don't want revenge. It's also a sign of justice then. So you can use these ideas as many ways as you want. It's the explanation which will make the difference.
Earnestly oppose violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths, the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for a nonviolent gadfly to create the kind of tension in society that will help man rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. I therefore concur with you on your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in the tragic effort to live in monologue rather than dialogue.
One of the basic points in your statement is that the action that I and my associates have taken in Birmingham is untimely. Some have asked, why didn't you give the new city administration time to act? The only answer that I can give to this query is that the new Birmingham administration must be prodded about as much as the outgoing one before it will act. We are sadly mistaken if we feel that the election of Albert Boutwell as mayor will bring the millennium to Birmingham. While Mr. Boutwell is a much more gentle person than Mr. Connor, they are both segregationists dedicated to maintenance of the status quo. I have hope that Mr. Boutwell will be reasonable enough to see the futility of massive resistance to desegregation, but he will not see this without pressure from devotees of civil rights. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. Lamentably, it is a historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals.
We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see, with one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied.
Okay, and so there's a classic definition of justice, especially justice that is delayed. So by saying wait, 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 injustice continues. And if they never get to you and resolve the issue, then again, injustice remains.
We've waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we stiff creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter.
Okay, part of justice is given to others what is their due, and part of that is the idea of equality. That according to the Constitution of the United States, everyone is created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore to be treated as equal. So not being able to order a cup of coffee at a counter is an injustice. And all Martin Luther King Jr. wants is for people to treat everyone as equals.
Perhaps it's easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of our 20 million Negro brothers smothering in.
So my apologies. This is the previous photos were of people being lynched. They put justice in their own hands, especially by the Ku Klux Klan, and they would tie them onto a tree and then hang them. This is what they wanted to do to Robinson in the Tom Robinson in the movie To Kill Mockingbird. When they went to the jail before the trial to take care of justice. Okay, this is what's called lynching.
An airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to a public amusement park that has just been advertised on TV. And sees tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children. And see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky. And see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking,
Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John. And your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs.
When you are harried by day and haunted by night, by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. When you go forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait.
Okay, now this idea of nobodiness is what we talked about objectification. And this is an example of injustice. And what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying that it's not that we are nobody, that we are somebody, and therefore treat us with love and respect. So this is what we've talked about in class about objectification, treating people as objects, and also selfishness on our part, where we only consider ourselves as important, and we call this individualism.
There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience.
You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. Since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools.
Okay, so here again it's talking about legal justice. The Supreme Court decided that they could not segregate people in school. They passed, they changed the laws, but just because a court says so doesn't mean that it actually happens. So when what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying here is that, yeah, you may think that we're breaking laws, but maybe those laws shouldn't have been there. Maybe they're unjustified. And then other laws that are justified, like desegregation, should be followed. So condemn those as much as you condemn us.
At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust.
Okay, and these are the things that we talked about in our unit on justice. There's between a just law and an unjust law, and you're going to hear familiar references to Aquinas and others.
I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all.
Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law.
Okay, and we talked about the four criteria of what makes a law just, and if any of the criteria are missing, then it makes it unjust.
Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority.
Okay. That's why I wanted you to pause and think about what he just said.
Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things.
And segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and awful.
Okay, and people are people. People are not things.
Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? Thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, where it is morally right, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong.
Okay, and remember we talked about this, looked at sin. Sin is missing the mark, failure to love God, to love each other, and ultimately to love ourselves. So this conversation that Martin Luther King Jr. is trying to have with these religious people brings it back down to the biblical notion of sin, the missing of love.
Consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make it binding on itself.
Okay, and this is the ultimate of hypocrisy. The law only applies to the blacks, but not to themselves. So this is what we mean by discrimination. And therefore it's unjust because it does not fulfill the good of all people, the common good.
This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another explanation. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up that state's segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from being registered voters. And there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured? Sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there's nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest.
And this peaceful assembly and protest is a constitutional right, but it doesn't apply to the black people, it only applies to the white people. So therefore, the law prohibiting a march is unjust.
I hope you were able to see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rapid segregation. That would lead to error. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty Ice has made. An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust.
Stop right there. So again, the idea is of following your conscience. You have a right to break an unjust law because it's unjust, but you must do so in a loving way. So example, again, you guys having trouble finding loving examples. You must do it lovingly. Disagree with the actions, but don't disagree with the person. Treat the people, even the segregationists, as people, not things, as ends, not means.
And who willingly deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. I hope you were able to see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rapid segregation. That would lead to error. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty Ice has made. An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. Of course.
Okay, and this point here is an excellent example of humility. Be humble enough to accept the consequences for your civil disobedience. Be humble enough not to be like the people who are oppressing. Be different. Be humble enough to take your position of weakness and make it a strength by not reacting with power and force. Okay, this is the ultimate sense of humility. Following your conscience and doing what your conscience has informed you is the right thing to do.
Once, there was nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidence sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience.
We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived
To certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic.
I just wanted to replay this, and a lot of reference to the things that we've talked about in class.
Freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience.
We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I had lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klan,
but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and constantly finds to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection.
I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace, in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight, to a substantial and positive peace, in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with. Like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates, to the light of human conscience and the air of natural opinion before it can be cured.
In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act of a misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see that, as the federal courts have consistently affirmed, it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber.
I'd also hope that the white moderate would reject the myth concerning time in relation to the struggle for freedom. I've just received a letter from a white brother in Texas. He writes, all Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually. But is it possible that you are in too great a religious hurry? It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The deeds of Christ take time to come to earth. Such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time, from the strangely rational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills.
Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation.
Okay, and this idea of forgiveness, repenting, of changing your direction is part and parcel of what we call love. And building a new society is what we talked about earlier in the course, being builders of the kingdom of God. And that's a kingdom of love, which we found in the Sermon on the Mount.
We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always right to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity.
You speak of our activity in
Okay, and the solid rock of human dignity is what we mean by the term solidarity.
Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of an extremist. I began thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency made up in part of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, are so drained of self-respect and a sense of somebody that they have adjusted to segregation.
Okay, and by this is an example of numbness. You're so used to being put down that you simply accept it. And you become complacent. And this is the way it is, this is the way it always has been, this is the way it always will be. And so it sort of takes all the energy out of you.
And in part of a few middle-class Negroes people, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because in some ways they profit by segregation, have become insensitive to the problems of the masses. The other force is one of bitterness and hatred, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence.
It is expressed in the various Black nationalist groups that are springing up across the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim.
Okay, so this is Nation of Islam. There's also later on the Black Panther movement. And so what Martin Luther King is saying here is that he's caught between two extremes. Those who are complacent and are unable to commit to any type of action because they become so used to as part of life is. And then on the other side are those, especially young people who are very, very angry and feel that the only way that they can solve it is by meeting violence with violence.
Numbers by the Negro's frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination.
This is
This movement is made up of people who have
Malcolm X.
faith in America, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. I have tried to stand between these forces, saying that we need emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the black nationalists.
Okay, during the Floyd George protests, you see the same dichotomy, same division. Those who were advocating for peaceful, nonviolent protests and marched in silent or marched calling out for justice, and then those who reverted to violence. And so Martin Luther King Jr. would be with the first group, not the second group. The minute you commit violence, then you're no better than the person who is committing violence towards you.
But there is a more excellent way, love and nonviolent protest. I am grateful to God that through the influence of the Negro Church,
the way of nonviolence.
Okay, and so there's another example of love. To things that we studied in class is love your enemy, turn the cheek. Aquinas, remember always, life is very important, and preserve life even of those who you disagree with and that you oppose.
Became an integral part of our struggle. If this philosophy had not emerged by now, many streets of the South would, I am convinced, be flowing with blood. And I am further convinced that if our white brothers dismissed as rabble-rousers and outside agitators those of us who employ nonviolent direct action, and if they refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions of Negroes, out of frustration and despair, will seek solace and security in Black nationalist ideologies. A development.
I just want to stop there. If you've watched the movie Black Panther, that is a two diametric forces. The use of knowledge and intelligence of the nation Kawanda for peace, or to use the technology to get revenge and to settle scores at justice.
That would inevitably lead to a frightening racial nightmare. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that he can be king.
Okay, and this idea of freedom is another understanding of the word justice. There can be no justice unless you're first alive, that you have life, and then secondly, that you're free. And look at all the things that we covered when we looked at human rights.
Consciously or unconsciously, he has been caught up by the racial nightmare. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that he can be king. Consciously or unconsciously, he has been caught up by the Zeitgeist, and with his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, the United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency toward the promised land of racial justice.
If one recognizes this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand why public demonstrations are taking place. The Negro has many pent-up resentment and latent frustrations and must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimage to the city hall. Let him go on Freedom Rise and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this is normal and healthy discontent.
Okay. And we talked about this, that anger is an indication that something is wrong, that it's unjust. It comes from inside. Something's bothering you about the situation. So what he's saying is that the Negro or the blacks have a right to be angry because of segregation. The problem, though, for Martin Luther King Jr. is how do you respond to the anger? What do you do with that anger? And he believes that you show love through nonviolence action rather than through violence.
Channel into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now this approach is being turned extremist.
But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love when he said, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you"? And
sorry, so here's having trouble with love. Here's an example from the letter and something we discussed in class. And what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying here is that Jesus was an extremist because he advocated for love, and his extremism resulted in him being put on the cross.
And pray for them.
I have tried to say that this is normal and healthy discontent. Channel into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action.
Before starting the video,
and now this approach is being turned extremist.
But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love when he said, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you"? Was it not Amos an extremist for justice when he said, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream"? And was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel when he said, "I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus"? Was not Martin Luther an extremist when he said, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God"? And John Bunyan, who said, "I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience." And Abraham Lincoln, who said, "This nation cannot survive half slave and half free." And Thomas Jefferson, who said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal."
So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extent of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime of extremism. 2 more were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. I had hoped that the white moderate would would see this need. Perhaps I was too optimistic. Perhaps I expected too much.
I suppose I should have realized that few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race, and still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action. I am thankful, however, that some of our white brothers in the South have grasped the meaning of this social revolution and committed themselves to it. They are still too few in quantity, but they are big in quality. Some, such as Ralph McGill, Lillian Smith, Harry Golden, James McBride Dabbs, Ann Braden, and Sarah Patton Boyle, have written about our struggle in eloquent and prophetic terms. Others have marched with us down nameless streets of the South. They have languished in filthy, infested jails, suffering the abuse and brutality of policemen who view them as dirty nigger lovers. Unlike so many of their modern brothers and sisters, they have recognized the urgency of the moment and sensed the need for powerful action antidotes to combat the disease of segregation.
Let me take note of my other major disappointment. I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I'm not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stands on this issue. I commend you, Reverend Stallings, for your Christian stand on this past Sunday in welcoming Negroes to your worship service on a non-segregated basis. I thank the Catholic leaders of this state for integrating Spring Hill College several years ago. But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who is nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, rabbis of the South, would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have become outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows.
In spite of my shattered dreams, I came to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause and with deep moral concern would serve as the channel through which our just grievances could reach the power structure. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I have been disappointed. I have heard numerous Southern religious leaders admonish their worshipers to comply with a desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers declare, "Follow this decree because integration is morally right and because the Negro is your brother." In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churchmen stand on the sideline and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities.
In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I've heard many ministers say, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I've watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes a strange, unbiblical distinction between body and soul, between the sacred and the secular. I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states on sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings. I've looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest?
Yes, these questions are still in my mind. The deep disappointment I have wept over the laxity of the church. But be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Yes, I love the church. How could I do otherwise? I'm in the rather unique position of being the son, the grandson, and the great-grandson of preachers.
Okay, so what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying here is that even though he's disappointed with members of the church, the Christian church or the Christian churches, he still loves them and he still forgives them.
Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ. But oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and through fear of being nonconformists. There was a time when the church was very powerful. The time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated.
With their effort and example, they brought an end to such an ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is weak, an effectual voice with uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo, far from being distributed by the presence of the church. The power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's sign, and often even vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust.
Perhaps I have once again been too optimistic. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? Perhaps I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the church within the church, as the true ecclesia and the hope of the world. But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. They have left their secure congregations and walked the streets of Albany, Georgia with us. They have gone down the highways of the South on torturous rides for freedom. Yes, they have gone to jail with us. Some have been dismissed from their churches and lost the support of their bishops and fellow ministers. But they have acted in the faith that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. Their witness has been the spiritual salt that has preserved the true meaning of the gospel in these troubled times. They have carved a tunnel of hope the dark mountain of disappointment.
I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are at present misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned that we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here.
For more than 2 centuries, our fur bearers labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. Before closing, I feel impelled to mention one other point in your statement that has troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended the Birmingham Police Force for keeping order and preventing violence. I doubt that you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its foes sinking their teeth into unarmed, nonviolent Negroes. I doubt that you would so quickly commend the policemen if you were to observe their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. You were to watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls. You were to see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys. You were to observe them as they did on 2 occasions, refused to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together. Can I join you in your praise of the Birmingham Police Department? It is true that the police have exercised a degree of discipline in the handling the demonstrators. In this sense, they have conducted themselves rather non-violently in public, but for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation.
Over the past few years, I've consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. I've tried to make clear that it's wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it's just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. Perhaps Mr. Connor and his policemen have been rather nonviolent in public, as was Chief Pritchard in Albany, Georgia. But they've used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of racial injustice. As T.S. Eliot has said, the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason.
I wish you had commended the Negro sit-inners and demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of great provocation. One day, the South will recognize its real heroes. There will be the James Merediths with a noble sense of purpose that enables them to face jeering and hostile mobs, and with the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of a pioneer. There will be the old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in a 72-year-old woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride segregated buses, and who responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness. My feet is tired, but my soul is at rest.
Okay, and this is famous Rosa Parks, who is often credited with the originator of the civil rights fight, where she refused to go to the back of the bus and sat where she was and got arrested.
There will be the young. There will be the old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in a 72-year-old woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride segregated buses, and who responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness. My feet is tired, but my soul is at rest. There will be the young high school and college students, the young ministers of the gospel, and a host of their elders, courageously and non-violently sitting in a lunch counter and willingly going to jail for conscience sake. One day, the South will know that when these disinherited children of God, sat down at lunch counters. They were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
Never before have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers?
If I had said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I had said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King, Jr.
Okay, let's see how we're doing. And one last one. The one I'm going to show you now is called just a song. A nice way to end it. There's a final video I'm not going to play, but it's an interview that Martin Luther King gave to NBC, and he talks about his life. And this is about I think about a month before he was assassinated. So sort of you might want to be interested in listening to him and imagining the strength of his character and the love for all people. So we'll have one more song. It's just a short one. It's a gospel song called "Oh Freedom," and then we'll stop. Okay. And my settings here. I don't have settings here. No settings here. Okay.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Over me. Over me. Yeah. Before I I'll be buried in my home and go home to my Lord
Okay. Okay, so sorry it's a long process, but I thought you might get some ideas and joy. So let's see a bunch of questions we have here. Um, okay, so I'm not sure how far back we're going, but Nathan had asked about the conclusion, and there's a summary of the definitions in the first part of conclusion, and basically it's a summary of a more thorough, complete understanding of each of justice, love, and humility. That will include the 5 ideas for each that you were able to work with. Then after that, you are to do what essentially is 3 reflection journals. Having done this course and having worked with the letter, what have you learned about what God wants us, how God wants us to be good by being just, loving, and humble? So, what have you learned about justice? What have you learned about love? And what have you learned about humility? So, this is going to be 2 marks each. So, consider it like 3 journals that you usually do in your journal book. And then you conclude with the thesis statement with Micah 6:8. So, that's Ethan's question. It's a long time ago. Let's see. This is a Jade asked about the 3rd step in every idea. So what you're supposed to do, first step is to find an idea from the course. Second is to find an example from the letter. And third, connect the 2. So explain the relevance of the characteristic you've chosen, or the example you've chosen, to the characteristic of the term. So it's basically adding, connecting A and B. So explaining why you picked the idea and how it shows, why you picked the line from the letter and how it shows the idea that you've selected. Okay. As in whatever affects one affects all directly. 2 ideas here. One is that we must always strive for the common good, not the individual goods. And what affects one person affects everyone. So you cannot stand idly by when somebody is being bullied in school, neither should you accept it in society. And therefore, if it hurts one person, the one who's being bullied or the one who's being denied their equality rights or their dignity, then it affects all of us. Okay, and then Helia, okay, no problem. Zilan, can we use examples from the video or all the examples? Okay, the examples from the video, basically what they've done in the video is read the letter and added some images that help you focus on what he means by that. So whatever's in the video is actually in the letter. So all those people took turns reading part of the letter. Okay, Zilan? Go ahead, Helia, no problems. Okay. Can you talk more about the humility and piety part? It's really hard to find ideas regarding this both in the letter and the course content. Okay, so I gave you some examples of humility. It means being humble. It means not trying to be superior to another person. It means loving your neighbor before you love yourself. This is what Jesus talked about. It means treating others as people, ends, not things. That's Immanuel Kant and his second maxim. And it means acting in a nonviolent and loving way is to be humble, not in a proud, arrogant way, which is the segregationist ideas about life and about reality. So you can use ideas from Socrates, Kant, It's recognizing the strength in the stranger of Levinus. You can use Jesus. You can use the virtues in the Catholic tradition. In your virtue chart, there's one on humility. Humility means humbleness or being humble, placing others before you, being responsible for others, loving others, and including your enemies. So those are all ideas you can use. Azine, lots of examples I gave you in watching the videos about love, and again, go to the virtues, to the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus. Emmanuel Levinus talks about love of the stranger. Jesus talks about loving your enemies, loving your neighbors, loving those who are vulnerable and disadvantaged, those who are prisoners or slaves. Martin Luther King talks a lot about that. St. Thomas Aquinas says that when it comes to love, you must always treat others equally and with respect and dignity. If you bold your quotes, then you're simply creating a distraction. So just put it in quotation marks if you're going to quote it, and if you're going to paraphrase it, then just write it out. But don't bold the quotes. It will stand out, but it's not necessary. So just keep the same same. I don't know what you call it. Same as the rest of the writing. For Amy, the format is on the sheet that I gave you. Okay, Amy, there should be introduction, and specific sections of the introduction should be all included. And then there should be 3 arguments or bodies of the essay, one for justice, one for love, one for humility. And then there's a conclusion. So follow the outline that I gave you. Make sure each of them are completed. The chart that I gave you, there is a marking scheme, so that's how you'll be evaluated, whether everything has been included and done properly. I know you're responding. I'll get back to you a second. I'm just going in order on this chat here. Okay, say when should we return our first quad master? Okay, that's a good question. Mr. Savidio and the office are going to let us know how we're going to return everything. So I'm sure you'll hear about it before I do. And when I do hear about it, then I'll remind you guys. For Zilla, yes, you can refer to it if it brings you to talk about things that are happening, especially now. Like I said to you earlier, this happened in the mid-60s. That's, let's see, mid-60s would be 53 years ago or 54 years ago. Things have not really changed that much. We've gotten better, but there's no segregation anymore. But just because you integrate, and you saw this with the movie The Insider, it's hard to make people get along. So it's hard. Amy, I'm not sure what you mean by the layout. I went over the layout. Any sourcing has to be at the bottom of the page or at the end of your essay. So it's endnotes or footnotes or endnotes. And I believe, Michelle, you're correct. They call that Chicago. I'm old school. Okay. I'm giving you 3 marks for proper sourcing, including bibliography. I did, Michelle. If you look at the last attachment I gave you with the CPT, I included a chart that has the same marking as in the outline that I gave you. But all I did was make it a little bit more comprehensive and showed where your marks are going to come from. Okay, so please look over that chart. I was going to ask you to include that chart, but what I'm going to do is Don't include the assignment. I'm going to print out a whole bunch of charts and then attach to each of your CPTs as I'm going through them. And I'm going to give you marks for them, and I'll go through each essay. I usually read it at minimum 2 times. I do a first reading and then a second reading just to make sure. So Michelle, let me know if you can't find that chart. Altogether, there's 17 paragraphs. So each introduction is 1 paragraph, conclusion is 2 paragraphs, and each idea is 1 paragraph. So justice should have 5 paragraphs, love should have 5 paragraphs, and humility should have 5 paragraphs. And there should be a space between each of the paragraphs. And please don't combine paragraphs. Then we call that a run-on paragraph, like a run-on sentence. It's on the bottom of the page, the CPT layout worksheet. The charts on the bottom, the most recent one. I wanted to show you how I'm going to mark it in chart form. But if you look also in the outline I first gave you, it has the breakdown of the marks. Okay, good. Kylie, I don't have my sheets here. What is Catholic social teaching number 4? Sorry, I've forgotten the order. If you could tell me what number 4 is, I can answer it, and I'll come back to the next person in line. You don't have to double space your assignment. You can use 1.5 spacing. So I'll write that down. 1.5 spacing. And times and 12. Okay. Okay, let me go back again. So 1.5 spacing is fine. Times font and 12 is comfortable to read. Louisa can use the movie of our course as an example to prove a point. The ideas, the main ideas of the movie assignments come from the course outlines. So you can use the movies as long as you use the ideas from the course. So for example, you might talk about justice in Freedom Riders, but it's the idea of justice that we got in the course. I'm hesitant to say yes to the movies. The movies are there to help you understand them, and so is the letter. Think of the letter as the movie now. Okay, so I'd rather you get the idea from the course, the ideas from the PowerPoint presentations, the homework assignments, encyclicals, the textbooks, etc., and then use those. Okay, Louisa? Okay, Patrick. C, I'm assuming that, okay, C is similar to what you've done all course. You always define the term, you give example from the story, or in this case, the letter, and then you explain why you picked that line, that example from the letter to show the meaning of the term. Okay, so as you've done throughout the whole course, you do the same thing for your CPT. You take the idea of justice, you find an example of justice in the letter, and then you explain why that example in the letter helps us understand the idea of justice of the person you picked. Okay? Okay, if you look at the chart, there's 2 paragraphs. Actually, it's more than 2 paragraphs. It's actually sort of my mistake. Your conclusion should actually be 4 paragraphs. One paragraph summarizing the 3 terms of Micah, and then 1 paragraph each reflection. So let me type that in. So thank you for bringing that up. Conclusion, I'll type it up. Should be 4 paragraphs. Um, 1 for the terms, and 1 for each reflection, justice, love, and humility. If you want to add a 5th paragraph, sorry about that. Okay, so I typed in the chat. I'll go back to the other question. So your very good point. Your conclusion should be 1 paragraph for summarizing the 3 terms of Micah 6:8, 1 paragraph for your reflection of what did you learn about justice, 1 paragraph for what did you learn about love, and 1 paragraph of what did you learn about humility. And you can add a 5th paragraph, putting it all together in 1 short 2 or 3 sentence paragraph, just to conclude your essay. Okay. So let's see what we have here. Okay, so Jade, I hope that answers your question, and I hope that also helps everybody else. I do want you to do small reflections of each of those terms as part of your conclusion. Okay, somebody wants to talk?
Yeah.
Okay, Nathan?
So what's the total amount of paragraphs that is required for the CPT?
How many words?
No, like total amount of paragraphs, total, complete total.
Okay, if we change the conclusion to be 4 paragraphs, 1 for your summary of the terms and 1 each of your reflections, so 3 reflections, that makes 4 for conclusion, 1 for introduction, that's 5, and then 15 for your body. So 5, 5, 5. So 20 paragraphs is your total length of the assignment. Does that help, Nathan?
Yeah.
Okay. It seems like a lot, but I understand 2 things. Number 1, you've had over a month to do it, and number 2, there is no exam, so the CPT becomes part of the, or in place of the exam, and this is 30% of your final mark. Everything we did in the course is 70%. So your progress report will have, if you look at your term work, at the last column is a mark at a 70, so it's already calculated for you. Then your CPTs were 30, and your final mark is 100. But thank you for asking that, Nathan. Let me just go through a few more questions. We still have over half an hour, so I'll keep going. I'll keep answering questions. Okay, Kylie, we come in contact with the poor and recognize that we are called to have a preference for them. Preferential option for the poor is an act of humility. It's also an act of love because you want to help them and do something for their condition. It's also an act of justice. You try to create an environment where they can participate and be part of society. So you can use that for any of the 3 examples. Again, for a zine, it'll be 4 paragraphs for conclusion. That makes 20 paragraphs altogether, okay? You're welcome, Louisa. So I typed up conclusion, 4 paragraphs. 1 for the 3 terms, to summarize the 3 terms in a more in-depth way than your simple definition, beginning and introduction. And then I need, similar to your journals, a reflection on justice, a reflection on love, and a reflection on humility. Each of them will be worth 2 marks, 2, 4, 6. and then you're finished. My conclusion part is 3 pages for 20 pages essay. It's fine. Yes, it's fine. There's no minimum, no maximum. Whatever it takes you to have, and especially when you're doing your reflection, it's like doing individual journals, and you may write more than 1 page because you've learned so much. And if you haven't learned much, tell me what you did learn. Okay. So 20 pages altogether. Wow, that's I'm impressed. I hope your CPT helps you learn about something that happened and something about life and something about yourself. Nathan, 21, if you want to conclude, yeah, if you want to add the 5th one, like 2 or 3 sentences. Okay, thank you if you want to. Patrick, could we also use stories from the course? Yes, Socrates is his idea. If you want to use that, you can use that in your body. You can also use that in conclusion. Even Martin Luther King Jr. makes mention of Socrates. And because he stood up for truth and knowledge, he was persecuted. He talks about Jesus because he just wanted people to learn how to love, and he was persecuted. Amos, anything that we've covered in class, Socrates is similar. And what's interesting is when you can use Socrates' quote, and then now you understand what the letter means when he uses Socrates himself. Okay, a new idea for to do. Introduce our own idea. Okay, Patrick, I'm not sure what you mean. Do you want to use something else about Socrates that we haven't covered in the class that you may have read or taken another class? I'm not sure what you mean, but if you could explain that. Okay, Patrick, I'll come back to you. We use Catholic social teachings for humility, love, and absolutely, Nathan. That's part of the course. There's lots of things in the social justice which are based on justice itself, on love, and also the humility to fight for justice. Okay, Celine, do we format the footnotes of bibliography in the same way for each source? I'm not sure what you mean by that, Celine. If you put it at the bottom of the page, it's an end note. If you put it at the end, bottom of the page is a footnote. At the end, it's an end note. Now, some people reduce the font. You can keep the same font as the same. Is that what you mean? If you could explain, for example, Kant, theoretical and practical reason. Okay, Kant, no, I get rid of the theoretical and practical reason. That's not the title of the document. Or if it comes from the textbook, then it's a textbook, the source. Don't put in theoretical practical reason, okay? If it's a particular slide, Celine, you can include like slide 5, but that's unnecessary. It's in the PowerPoint per se. If you're talking about theoretical practical reason, then you include that in your sentence. But otherwise, you don't put that in your footnote. Unless you're more advanced and you want to discuss it in your footnote as well. No, your footnote and bibliography would be Kant PowerPoint presentation. But get rid of the theoretical and practical. Just put Kant as the title of the PowerPoint. Okay? Okay, good. Let me go back. Sorry. Give me a second. I'll come back to you guys. So Nathan, Catholic social teachings is good. Celine, we got through the footnote bibliography. Patrick. Okay, thank you, Patrick. Okay, Nathan, do we put all the footnotes in the bibliography? No, you don't put all the footnotes. If you used 5 sources from, let's say, we're talking about Kant's PowerPoint, then you will have 5 footnotes or endnotes that refer to Kant's PowerPoint presentation that I showed you. In your bibliography, you would only put Kant PowerPoint presentation once. Yes, it's only only the PowerPoint or the textbook or the letter or a handout from the document. Now, if you use different documents from my package, you would have to refer to each of the documents separately as part of your bibliography. Okay? Any other questions? I hope I haven't missed anybody. So for example, my last point, if you're using my handouts and you use Veritas Splendor, then that should have a separate bibliography. And if you use Kant, that should be a separate. If you use the chapter on Immanuel Kant, that should be a separate one in the bibliography, because they're separate parts of the same official text or unofficial text that I've used. And you're referring to those sort of handouts. In the text, it's just once. Okay? If you use the textbook, then you don't have to repeat them all for the textbook, but if it's different handouts, then you have to have different handouts for the package. Okay. Azine, the only homework you have is work on your CPT. Okay. So we still have half an hour. Let's take a few minute break. I'll be back in 2 minutes, and then we'll continue with any other questions you may have. Okay, so I'll be back in 2 minutes. For any questions you may have. Okay, so I'll be back in 2 minutes.